try to stick to the 12 minutes with the help of Carlos. I was involved in the Velasco movement, revolution, and military revolution since the 69. And I was charged with looking at the Amazonian area, the Amazonia Peruana, which, as you may know, constitute more than 50% of the national territory, although historically it has been conceived as an empty territory, especially by the Laonde, the first government, who pushed forward the conquista del Peru por lo peruano, the idea that that land had to be occupied by real people, not indigenous people. And so when I was charged with that, I had to do a very superficial survey of how many people were in the Amazon, how many of them were considering themselves indigenous. A self-definition very problematic, because after 500 years of colonialism, many of them decided to become, quotes unquote, mestizo, ribereño, rather than indigenous, disguising their ethnicity. And there was practically no information. Why was I recruited? I was recruited because I just finished my dissertation, which was turned into a book called La Sal de los Cerros, Salt of the Mountains, which was dedicated to the history of resistance of the Ashaninka, the Kampa Ashaninka people. And in that history of resistance, I rediscovered something that had been studied very, relatively superficially by other historians, which is the rebellion or revolution, I call it, of Juan Santos Atahualpa, 1748, a movement that paralyzed and closed the central Amazonia, La Selva Central, for more than 100 years to the penetration of colonial Peru and then Republican Peru. It was only Ramon Castilla that was able to reconquer that part of the Amazon by using machine gun and cannons, actually, against the Ashaninka, the Yanesha, the Machiguenga, the No-Maxiquenga, and other groups. So my interpretation of the Amazon was very deeply historical, and when I was surprised with this offer to come and help the Velasco regime to find some sort of solution to return some form of autonomy to the indigenous people, I was really challenged. First, because of the lack of knowledge of the rest of the Amazon. When I wrote my dissertation, I found, as I mentioned yesterday, only two important sources about the Amazon, anthropological sources. Thousands of documents, totally irrelevant, which were documents written by the Franciscan, the Dominican, the Jesuit, more important, the Jesuit and the Franciscan, as you may know, but still very little, quotes unquote, scientific information. So what we had to do with very scarce resources, just a few former students of mine, a few colleagues, I'm talking about 5-6 people at the most, a legal lawyer, a constitutional lawyer that was helping me to design some sort of law legislation. We had to try to explain to the military regime, to the Velasco, to Sinamos, to the Gran Reform, what was to live in the Amazon for 10,000 years as an indigenous, autochthonous, native, and what were the needs of modern society, of modern, relatively speaking, society, to go into this area and interact with these people. What were the legal basis for interacting with these people? No legal basis, actually. Colonialism. If colonialism is a legal system, yes, that was what happened in the Amazon for many, many centuries. So that process was enlightening for me, obviously. And I was terrified, because my only experience was with the Ashaninka of the Gran Pajonal, which is an area relatively marginal in the upper Amazon. Pajonal is a grassland between the Andes and the lower Amazon at 1,500 meters on the sea level, savanna and tropical rainforest. And the Ashaninka managed this environment, very complex, very complicated, hostile, quotes unquote, from a modern point of view, environment for centuries, probably for millennia, and in a very efficient, effective mode. Only recently I found that I sort of commissioned, quotes unquote, a study to a colleague, Soren Valkov, who had, using satellite imaging and all of that, has really confirmed that the Ashaninka are much more productive and much more ecologically oriented than any of the other attempts that have been performed in exploiting agriculturally and forestry that area. They regenerate the forest by the system that they use, instead of destroying the forest. While in modern technologists destroy in order to extract, and extractive process in the Amazon has been terribly destructive. So, to make this very long story short, during 4 years of my life with very few colleagues, we issue a series of basic documents of what was the life and the expectation of these people. There are more, at that time we counted 62 major ethnic groups in the Amazon, some with 40, 50, 60,000 people, the Ashaninka, other with a few thousand, other with hundreds, other almost close to disappearing as indigenous autonomous entities. And all of those groups spread in hundreds, if not thousands, of small communities. Well, the first challenge was to define community, because the agrarian reform process, based on Andean conception of what it is, a community, was demanding us, and agronomists and ingenieros, agrónomos, y todos ellos juntos were asking, Stefano, what is a community? Do they live in community? Yes, but it is a community that is not concentrated in the village. It's a community that is based on a system of lineages, kinship, very complicated, many complicated kinship system, and they have a conception of territoriality that is not the Andean or peasant conception of territoriality, which is my plot of land, my house, and that's it. And then the other plots of land will belong to the community, and that are managed communally. So we invented a community, and we gave it a name, Comunidad Nativa. Why Nativa? Because the terms that were used were very racist, were chunchos, were salvajes, were cervícola, were amazónico was one of the best. And so we had to invent a term that was neutral. And so I went to the dictionary and I said, well, native. Native is good because there are no prejudices against native. Right? We are all native, right? Somewhat. Actually, I have a sticker that said, "Sono todos nativos." And then we invented the community, and we defined the community in terms of territorial occupation. And that was the most difficult proposition for a modern revolutionary government. We have to settle this, settle in a piece of land with boundaries. Mapping, important. Mapping is a colonial instrument. It's been always a colonial instrument. It was still and is still today a colonial instrument. See the Yasuní Park in Ecuador, which is challenged now, threatening destruction again. So we did that job, and finally we were able to set up a law. And that law was passed just before I left Peru, just before Moorhead gave the wonderful counter coup that brought back Peru to the original oligarchic system that we now enjoy thoroughly with Mr. Humala and all the followers of Mr. Humala. The law was passed. Then the most important result of the law was that in order to produce the law, we had to consult with the people. And what is now a demand of the United Nations, a special commission for indigenous people, we were practicing already. Going to the community and asking, what do you think about this law? And so we received responses from the Ashaninka, the Yanisha, the Machigengas, the Wahuna, Waluna, the Wampi, Wambisa, and that was it, basically. And some of the Quechua, Quechua Lamas and Quechua Denam. Consultation is a very difficult process. Language obstacle. We didn't have money for viaticos, for going per diem in the middle of the jungle. Transportation was a huge problem. So we consulted what we could do, and we came back with those results, and we said, okay, this is what we had to do. We had to define territory. You know, define territory in areas that were occupied heavily by colonists. They were pushed there because of the lack of agrarian reform up in the Sierra. Belaunde was pushing people into the empty Amazonia. So the territorial situation was very complex. A mosaic of private property, invaders of land, squatters, mixed in tribal land, people very upset, especially the Awaruna, the Aguajón, you know, trying to spare and kill colonists whenever they had the opportunity to do so, 2 minutes. And so that was the most important challenge that we had to overcome. The law was passed, and now, as I speak, probably 3 years ago, 10 million hectares have been titled for indigenous community. From very small plots, practically plots of family, that are interspersed in the colonos, to large tracts of land. The most successful was the Matzes preservation, the Mayuruna, they were called at the time. Almost 500,000 hectares. They control it completely. It's in the border of Brazil. Nobody is interested, again, although I just saw a beautiful poster that Carlos showed me, in which Belaunde appears in a drawing similar to Juan Poma drawing conquering the Peru. Belaunde was responsible for having bombed the Mayuruna with the Air Force, the Peruvian Air Force, with the help of the American Southern Command from Panama. Helicopters were sent from Panama to the Mayuruna, Yaquerana River to bomb Mayuruna, Matzes. But we were able to reserve 500,000 hectares for them, and they are still there. And I hope that the Mayuruna are happy and maybe recognize what the Velasco regime did for them. So the result were good, but the most important result was the mobilization of the indigenous people of the Andes. That became and are still the most important social movement in Peru today. The most important. When I was hearing your beautiful presentation, I was thinking, IDESEP is mobilizing not only indigenous people in the Amazon, but indigenous people in the Sierra. And then I was in Peru 2 or 3 years ago. The Xaninka invited me back to the Sal de los Cerros to see the Salto del Monte, which is preserved. I'm pushing now, sorry, I'm taking another minute, for declaring the Sal de los Cerros a national monument. Very difficult to do. So that no invasion of the Sal de los Cerros was threatened to be given to the Japanese a few years ago to exploit it, to be exploited. In any case, I went there, and in a meeting of Ashaninka, they had invited Andean leaders to talk about mining in the Andes. The Ashaninka had invited Andean Quechua speakers to talk about how can we defend ourselves from mining company from Canada. Thank you very much, Canada, for having provided us with a reason to struggle. So that is what I try to write in this very short article.
Thank you, Stefano. And our second speaker in this panel is Carey from the Rest Garden.
Thanks, Paulo, for the invitation, and to the sponsors for having us all here. I really appreciate the opportunity. I have a more standard PowerPoint. I think I go to more scientific conferences than history conferences. So, and there, if you don't have a PowerPoint, you're just not even allowed in the room. So here we go with that. But there's lots of pretty pictures. I try to, or at least pictures of the desert blooming. So this is a project about irrigation, a large-scale irrigation project in La Libertad, and the Chimbote project. And I came onto this by trying to look at more present-day issues with coastal irrigation and agro-industrial development and water issues right now with climate change. That's how I came onto this project. But it started in the 1980s, and pretty much everyone who studies Chimbote has really looked at it since construction started in 1986 and saw it always as an opera, Alan Garcia kind of a project, but I wanted to look a little bit deeper and get some of the roots because I knew there had been discussions of this for decades and decades, and just to see what role, if any, Velasco had played in that. So that was the idea where I was coming from, and then also to put water into this. There's lots of discussion of agrarian reform and very little discussion, it seems like, of water and the new water law that was passed right at the same time as agrarian reform, because, well, as this case shows really well, you can give people land, but if there's no water for it, it's worthless. So those two things, I think, should be put together much more often than they have been. So to place you a little bit here, and I know we're tilted to the side here, but you can get a sense. Here's Chimbote, Trujillo would be up here. This is the Santa River, that's the important thing, and it's born up above the Callejón de Huaylas and Huaraz, Caraguas, Uruguay up there in the Cordillera Blanca with glaciers. The Santa River is the most voluminous river in all of western Peru, and that's because of the glaciers that are up in the Cordillera Blanca that bring so much water, especially in the dry season. Really, there's still water flowing, actually, in the Santa River, which is amazing. So the idea with Chavimochic, as has long been envisioned, is a three-stage project. You take water from down, so you can get a mouse. This is down around in here is the Boca Toma. So that's where they're diverting water out of the Santa River, taking it hundreds of kilometers north up past Trujillo, is the idea, through several watersheds. Chao, Vedu, Moche, and Chicama, into each of those different watersheds to bring water up there. The idea is not just irrigation and opening up land to irrigation and agriculture, but there's other components, which is potable water. And now almost 800,000 people in Trujillo, in the Trujillo area, are getting water from the Santa River from this project, which is a huge number of people from it. And they're also generating hydroelectricity, among other things associated with it. But those are the main thrusts and the main ideas. The important thing is at this stage right now, only stage 1 and stage 2 are finished, although the government has just now approved stage 3, and there's bids out right now for the $700 million stage 3 project, and those are supposed to be submitted by November of this year. So this is still moving and still going along. This is a lot of information, but just a little bit to show you what's happening in the 3 different stages and what they're estimating here. But you can see that they're improving irrigated lands. This would be in what they call the old valleys that have been irrigated from the Chao, Veru rivers for a long time. And then there's the new lands, the incorporated areas, and those would be the intervalley areas that were essentially just sand up until they started this project. You can see that they've done tens of thousands of hectares of new land and improved agriculture in those areas as well. This is the Mother Canal. You can see it going down through there, and you can see how the desert is really. I mean, it's quite green in the areas where the irrigation exists, and then up here you can see it's just sand over here where it's not existed. So there's been a huge transformation. You can see it's quite an engineering project. Okay, so to step back a little bit, this was first envisioned, the first time people really talked about diverting the Santa River was in 1912, some engineers. It was a series of studies then, starting in the 1930s, but in particular in the 1940s. And then the Santa Corporation did a bit more in the late 1950s and early 1960s to really study and do a lot of technical analyses of how to divert this water from the Santa and actually carry out the engineering to get it going much farther north, which is, yeah, it's really remarkable that they can even do it. So, I mean, no matter what you want to say about it, how you want to come down on the Chavimochic project, the engineering for it is just phenomenal that they've been able to do this. It is quite an amazing project. So there is a bit of background, and I'll come back to why this background matters a bit more in the conclusions, but just to show there is a trajectory there. So what happens with Velasco in particular, since we're talking about that period? He's not the one, and it's not the military government who really starts the project. That's not until the 80s. So what is the role that's played during the post-1969 there and over those next few years? And I would say the first main point to make here is about the land reform that does happen, the agrarian reform, and this really unseats the estates that had been there for a long time. And so this taking away from their power, their long-standing control, these are the big sugar estates and the cotton, and those are then put into the cooperatives. We know this story pretty well, I think, so I'm not going to rehash it now with only 7 minutes left. But anyways, the taking away of the land, and then that becomes important later on because it becomes more fragmented, and that actually and ironically by dislodging the estate owners from that, it allows the fragmentation to happen later, and then that can help selling it and privatizing it in a much after the 80s, and especially once Fujimori is in power in the 1990s. So, in other words, if the big estates had stayed in power, I think that the Chimbote project would have faced a lot more difficulty, because it wouldn't have been just put the state in control of land, and then it allowed this fragmentation to occur, especially when the cooperatives were not working so well in terms of their productivity. Then that meant that they started dividing themselves up, and then that allowed this much more kind of small-scale individuals to come in, and then in turn, once Fujimori after 1993 in the liberalization, that allows companies in particular to come in there. So the changing hands of the land ownership is really fundamental, and I think that's a big step in terms of the Chimbote project coming about. Another is the water, and this again, it's the state involvement here. But the 1969 water law, this then makes water managed by the government and for the people. And so this is a huge change, because previously it had been the 1902 water code that had been in effect, and that essentially just upheld the estate owners and the haciendas, and it just allowed them to continue using the water in the way that they had always been using it, and it gave them most of the authority, or all the authority, and they could essentially do what they wanted. Now, after 1969, at least in theory, at least in the law, of course I'm sure on the ground, and this is something I haven't looked into yet, on the ground it's a very different story of who's actually using the water. And whether they were out there really measuring it every day, no, they weren't actually doing that. But at a theoretical level, there's this huge transformation over to water managed by the state, in particular the Ministry of Agriculture. Now you have engineers from Lima, now you have the technocrats. So there's also a discursive change that's also going on. It's not about who has the water, but it's much more about how many cubic meters of water are flowing and how much people get. And it's a real switch in the language and the rhetoric used to describe the water, and it is all managed. There's smaller regional watershed-based groups that are there, but still they're run very often by the Ministry of Agriculture. So there is a big shift, I would say, discursively, management-wise, and the technocracy coming in there to be involved in the water much more. And once again, what Chimbote is essentially doing is taking water out of the Santa River and running it all the way up through these other valleys. And so if you had continued to have estates and haciendas that were much more in control of that water, especially if you go up the Santa River watershed, or down the Santa River watershed, if you had those estate owners continuing to be in power rather than the state, I think it would have been much more difficult to implement the Chimbote project, which is really a state-run engineering project from the time it starts in the 1980s. So this is a transformation in terms of water management that really has to take place before Chimbote can happen. On the ground, what were people in La Libertad thinking during the 1970s? Well, on the one hand, between 1969 and 1973, there was not a water shortage. This was not a time, there was the El Nino from 72 to 73, but also the drought of the late 1960s had given way by 1969, and so there was relatively abundant water supplies, and so the Chimbote project wasn't actually on people's minds as much as it might have been if that had just happened to be a drought period. But they were continuing still, nonetheless, to be very worried about the fact that they did want their water supply, they did want potable water, they wanted hydroelectricity, and they wanted protection over the long run from drought. So they did keep up these demands and these claims to the government, and hoping that Chimbote could bring that. And Velasco's government did do several studies, feasibility studies on Chimbote, but they didn't actually ever implement it. One other aspect here is that the negative views of the cooperatives from the 1970s, this later becomes a big argument of, well, that failed, and so we should do something different, which is kind of justifies Chimbote. So in some ways, I've pointed to, we could say that the land is an issue, that the water is an issue, the discursive change is an issue, the state being in control. All these are kind of fundamental things that changed between 1969 and 1975 that help the implementation of the project later. But still, there's several other things that I don't want to put too much emphasis on what Velasco did. It is an opera project. I mentioned drought. If the droughts had been different, that could have radically shaped things. And since I'm an environmental historian, I'll always make a case for the agency of non-human nature that's out there. And so I think we should always be considering the role of climate and environmental conditions. There was a 1970 earthquake also. They're much more focused on rebuilding infrastructure rather than building new things after that on the coast here. And then I have to emphasize Fujimori's plans in the 1990s also. So there's a bit. And then also there's this long term. It's not just this technical language that comes about after 1969 with the engineers in Lima in control of the water law and implementation. That had really been there for a long time. I would say it really starts in the 1930s and 40s with the studies. So it's not all just that period. So anyways, those are some ways of thinking, I think, about and relating this directly to Velasco. I'll just throw in here quick in the last minute about the future. As I mentioned at the beginning, I came into this because I'm interested in water and climate kind of issues right now. So what I'm wondering for the future is, as water levels are going down, are we going to start to see huge conflicts in this area that are going to emerge again with the big companies now on the coast who've consolidated control versus highland campesinos in the fighting for Santa River water? We'll have a Chinecas, we'll have the Chimbote and La Libertad fight here about this project. We'll also have hydroelectricity interests versus agriculture, and they're already warring with each other in the Santa River watershed about who has the right to that and what's happening. This is what water supply looks like from melting glaciers. Probably everyone has heard that Lima was going to lose its water, right, because glaciers are melting. So you've heard this scenario probably, that initially when glaciers melt, you have more water and then it starts to fall. And you can see these stages that you go through. And these are some sub-watersheds in the Cordillera Blanca. They're all past what's called the peak water. So water supply is already going down up there. So this is already a huge issue, and there's going to be a lot more water concerns. And then the last thing I'll say, which is what my previous work was all done, is on glacier hazards up in the upper watershed. And if a hazard were a disaster, an outburst flood, an alluvion, or another avalanche like 1970 were to happen and hit one of these two Bocatomas, the Chinecas and the Chimbote, if the Chimbote gets hit, we're talking about 800,000 people without potable water in the city of Trujillo. You would have an environmental and disease calamity like you can't even begin to imagine. So there's still incredible vulnerability and lots of other issues that come right up to the present with these kind of issues at Chimbote. So there's a lot more to that up to the present. I just wanted to throw that in a little bit, even though that's not Velasco focused. But anyways, there it is. So thanks.
So I'm going to look at a very small portion of the Velasco regime's very important role in the town of Chimbote. And I probably could write 3 or 4 more papers for this conference if I had time. I think a lot of what Mark said about Chimbote, we could talk about Chinecas on the other hand. There's a lot about the earthquake in 1970 that could be looked at in greater detail. But today I'm going to look at fishing and the Fishermen's Union in this town of Chimbote. So Chimbote in the late 18th century, people from Trujillo arrived at Chimbote. They settle it. It's a small fishing village. By 1940, the population is around 4,200 people. And most of them working in agriculture and in finance, fishing, this type of thing. In 1941, the state selects Chimbote as the site for the National Steel Mill, as sort of the ultimate in modernization project. Steel is the path to the future, and Chimbote is selected as a site precisely because of the Rio Santa and the amount of water that flows through it. That was seen as the best place for a hydroelectric program. This starts a massive wave of investment in Chimbote, both by the state and later by private interests. The state builds a steel mill. They build the Hotel Chimu, which becomes a honeymoon destination apparently for people from Lima going to Chimbote, where there was very long beaches, but that's another topic for another day. In the 1950s, we start to see fishermen, industrialists erecting fish meal plants in Chimbote. There's a very rich, to say it moderately, aquatic life around Chimbote in particular. I mean, the Peruvian coast is perhaps the most productive fishing ecosystem in the world, and the area around Chimbote is one of the more productive regions within that. Industrialists select Chimbote as sort of a place where they can do pretty much what they want, and they do that for the next 20 years. So starting in the 1950s, Chimbote undergoes this sort of massive growth spurt. You can see in the areas in black on this 5-part map show the growth of the city from being rather small and centric to by 1970 expanding right along most of the coast of the bay. So you have this population growth from 4,000 people in 1940 to around 200,000 people in 1970. You have the development of the steel industry, the only one in the nation. You have the development of this fish meal industry, and fish meal is additive for chicken feed and hog feed in the 1970s. Now it's being used for salmon feed as well. This arrival of so many people to Chimbote creates a real drastic situation in the city. More people come to Chimbote than the industry can employ. You have a lot of marginalization, the creation of many barriadas, many shanty towns, and environmental problems. There's really no control over no effective control over the pollution that the factories were emitting. Chimbote becomes, in a lot of ways, the ultimate externality of the fish meal industry. We have 30 factories operating at any one time. They're heavily polluting. In the early 60s, they're operating 24/7, basically gushing out what they call agua de cola, stick water, a mixture of fish scales, blood, and fish oil, that the fishermen are just too lazy, the fishing industrialists are just too lazy to clean up, even though if they cleaned it up, they could increase their profits. Fish meal operators don't pay much attention to the impact that the smoke that the fish meal industry is creating is having on the city, and the city is sort of enveloped in the 1960s by white smoke. So it's a story of powerful industrialists that are manipulating the local government, which is essentially powerless to stop them. Very little effective government control at a national level. There is, in Callao, there's fish factories pop up in Callao in the 1950s and 1960s, but the people of Lima complain, and the industry essentially moves to Chimbote because they don't want to deal with complaining limeños, but who cares about Chimbotanos? We also see the development of a very vibrant union movement, both in the fishing industry and throughout Chimbote. The steel mill union is extremely active, but it's under the control of APRA, and APRA has this relationship with the Peruvian fish mill industrialists that is quite subservient. Right? So here's our friend the anchoveta. In English we call it probably an anchovy, but apparently it's not the same thing. It's maybe 12 to 18 centimeters long. The development of this industry has a lot of problems. The pollution, which I've already mentioned, is a major factor for Chimbote. The industry is extremely profitable, or has the potential to be extremely profitable. Banks saw a lot of potential in Chimbote. and lent a lot of money, which spurred investment. Of course, they're lending money at high interest rates for short periods of time, which is fine when when there's fish available, because the producers can make their money back. When there's no fish available, which happens in El Nino years, basically, the industry the problems with the industry really pop up. So the industry grows quickly. It grows much too fast for the ecological capacity of the fishery. By 1970, Peruvian fishermen could essentially fish the world's fishing catch themselves. They have the boat size and the factory capacity to do that. They could fish the Peruvian fishery in about 3 months. So it's way too big. It's way too much investment in the industry. The industrialists have too much power over politicians, and this is when Velasco steps in, right? So you have this industry that's sort of playing with ecological catastrophe, and this comes in 1972. So this chart shows the Peruvian fish capture in blue, the total fish capture in blue, and the capture of anchoveta in red. And as you can see, in the years of basically from 66 to 72, we're talking 98% being one species of fish. And that, of course, the anchoveta is also the key fish in the ecosystem. It's the fish that eats the abundant phytoplankton and zooplankton off the coast. It's also the fish that larger, probably better fish for industrial purposes, canning and whatnot, hake, mackerel, tuna, bonito, consume, right? So the fishermen, or the fishing industrialists and the fishermen are targeting this one species, okay? By the time that the revolutionary government comes on board, fish meals is the nation's leading export. It's providing about 15% or so of the national budget. Chimbote Peru's become the world's leading fishing nation. They're catching more fish than any other country in the world, surpassing the US, Norway, and especially China and Japan. And Chimbote has become the world's largest fishing city, the fishing port. And the Chimbote fishermen are producing more fish than all of the fishermen in all of the United States, for example. Okay? But it's, as I said, it's an extremely problematic industry. But the revolutionary general saw sort of great potential in this. And I think that's Tupac.
Yeah.
So the generals see fishing as a major issue that they have to tackle. They see potential in fishing, not only for export as fish meal, but also as food. They wanted to solve Peru's protein deficiency by getting Peruvians to eat fish. And I guess I'd have to do more research into why Peruvians don't like to eat fish, but they're not taking advantage of all of this. Well, I mean, they don't like to eat fish as much as they like to eat chicken or beef.
You mean anchoveta?
Yeah.
So we eat all of them.
But nobody eats anchoveta though. Not really.
Well, yeah, we don't eat anchoveta.
So yeah, the Velasco regime tries to incentivize fishing or the consumption of fish for like direct consumption of fish, as opposed to indirect through fish meal being turned into hog and chicken. They pay attention to regulation pretty much for the first time. They try to manage the fishing industry. They take over the marketing and exporting of fishing, creating a couple new bureaucratic institutions, and I don't think the Velasco regime was ever afraid of creating a bureaucratic institution. Along those lines, they create a Ministry of Fishing for the first time. Prior to this, the Ministry of Fishing had been part of the Agriculture Ministry. Now they separate off the fishing from the Agricultural Ministry. They put the Fishing Ministry in this brand new building on Javier Prado in Lima, one of the big boulevards. It's now the Museum of the Nation. But I think this sort of shows sort of the importance that fishing has for Peru. Okay. and for the ministry. Okay? Oh God. Okay. Oh, excuse me. Well, they expropriate the fishing industry because of El Nino, and they create Pesca Peru on May 7th, 1973. Overnight, that becomes the world's largest fishing nation with 27,000 employees and a lot of financial headaches. Back to Chimbote. As I said before, they're extremely unionized under APRA control, and this union, and the arrow is pointing to Dionisio Orna, the leader of the clasistas. The classists were sort of left-wing labor movement that emerged in the 60s that challenges APRA's control over the unions. In the late 60s, the union movement splits, and the clasistas take control over from the APRA. The leader of the clasista split in the late 60s is Franco Baca. Franco Baca then becomes leader for the next 5 or 6 years, and what we see happen in the mid-60s, we see happen under the revolutionary rule. This sort of left-wing Baca becomes very close to the revolution, becomes an advisor to Pesca Peru, has a very close relationship, and that relationship of APRA closeness to the fishing industry sort of replicates in Chimbote. So skip. Anyways, in May 1973, we have what's called the Chimbotazo, when the very split fishing union between the government on the one side, the government, sort of the official union of the government, the MLR, the National Revolutionary Labor Movement, and the clasistas on the other side have sort of their ultimate confrontation, where the MLR and the government forces open up fire on a sort of multi-union demonstration that's going on in late May of 1973. The police open fire, they kill 2 people, and sort of, I think, show a lot of the problems with the revolutionary movement. So in terms of conclusions, I think Chimbote and its fishermen play a significant role in the revolution. I think a role that is up to this point sort of unrecognized. And I think the RGAF's, the revolutionary government's attempt to co-opt labor ultimately replicates the problems that existed before 1968. Those started out, I think, doing well with the union. We see sort of the problems there. And I think more, I'd like to offer some ideas for future research. Looking at, I think Mark brings up good points about the environment and the revolutionary government's relationship with the environment and this idea of environmental authoritarianism. I think we need to look at the labor history of the revolutionary government, especially the emergence of the MLR, that is painted in the few works that refer to it. This MLR is painted as ultra-derechista and fascistic. And I think that's probably perhaps not exactly accurate, but I need to do a lot more research into that. I think, and thinking about the idea of regions in this panel, especially, we can look more at regionality. And then 1973 as a key moment in the revolution, particularly with the decline of Velasco as a healthy and perhaps powerful person. I think that the year 1973 really needs to be thought of a bit more, and I'm sure we'll learn more about that later from Adriana. So thank you. Sorry for my...
Okay, we have time for questions, and I think for the sake of keeping us on schedule, we will collect several questions and then we'll give each of the speakers here an opportunity to answer all of them at once. So the floor is open for questions and comments. Jamie?
Question for both Mark and David. I'm wondering if you could speak to sort of ideas of ownership, where fish and where land are concerned. How do the state and how do citizens think of these things? We have land for those who work it, so fish for whom, and water for whom. And my question for Stefano would be, would you do anything differently differently? I mean, sort of knowing about.
Would I have
Would you
done?
do anything differently? Knowing what you know now, would you do anything differently?
So yes, for Nathan first, I think to start with, I think it was really admirable the sort of mix of political economy and environmental history of Chimbote. This idea of Chimbote as an externality of the industry, I think it's wonderful. And one thing I wanted to ask you, which I think it's something you didn't have the time to develop, is this MLR. A lot of the literature that talks about it emphasizes its role as sort of the institution of infiltration since the time of Velasco in this popular movement. And they talk a lot about the role of APRA in that. And sometimes it seems as if it's just because of the Tantalean is there and he has links with APRA. I don't know if you know more about that. I'm just curious about it. To Stefano, I wonder if there's a sort of this ideology of the Amazon as a frontier. Is there an ideologue of sorts in Peruvian history? Sort of, is Belaunde Frederick Jackson Turner of the Peruvian Amazon? Is there sort of an ideological source besides the practicality of it? And so, and to Mark, I wonder what was lost during this process of water, like giving water to some. Who lost water, or who lost with the change of the desert landscape in this process, if anyone at all?
I was just hoping to get a common theme with these wonderful papers, and that's the theme of nationalism. And we all know the military government was defined by its very inherent nationalism, and I was kind of hoping to, if you could comment on just how each of these projects or processes related back to concepts of the military's own nationalism, particularly in Chimbote. How do these unions get involved with kind of the anchovy wars, I think they were called, these fairly notable diplomatic fracases between the United States and Peru over fishing rights, and same thing with the water law. I mean, how was this integrated into nationalist discourse, and also how were people in the Amazon traditionally kind of forgotten in Peruvian nationalism? How did the military kind of rhetorically integrate them in this concept of its new type of nationalism?
Yeah, I had a question for Nathan, because I was thinking about the more probably symbolic practices of these unions and these fishermen. And one of the images that actually you showed, I'm not sure if it is Velasco, but behind you can see an image of Jose Olaya. And Jose Olaya is like, you know, it's a very emblematic figure because he's a fisher and he was a fisherman, and he was acknowledged by the military as one of its official heroes in the early 1960s when they created the new branch of transmissions that later became communications. And I don't know if you saw part of this rhetoric among the fishermen, because I was thinking about Tupac Amaru, and there were some questions about the image of Tupac Amaru in the previous panel, but I don't know if Jose Olaya really plays part of this bigger discourse of, you know, the more symbolic repertoires of these units.
Other questions or comments? Yes.
I wonder if Nathan could tell us a bit more about the political rise of Chile and Tanzania.
Okay. So we'll probably follow the same order. Stefano, first.
The question by Jamie is an existential question. Yes, I would have done very few things differently. Mark, I don't know. What I didn't know at that time, and I explained a little bit that in my writing, is that I had a very relatively limited understanding of the entire Amazon area of South America. And I didn't have a Brodelian view of the Amazon. I acquired that a little bit later. And after the 90s, studies of the Amazon in general, the larger Amazonian area, have changed completely from the Betty Meggers approach, which was very pessimistic, to a more optimistic approach. Betty Meggers basically said, in the Amazon, there's nothing more than people can do but live in this kind of tribal society limited to an economy of subsistence, etc., etc. And also we didn't understand at the time, I didn't understand the effect of colonialism on slash and burn agriculture. Slash and burn agriculture has increased tremendously after the arrival of metals, because try to cut down a tree with a stone axe. By the way, in the Amazon, stone axe were produced in Peru for the most of the Amazon, because it's where we have found workshop of stone axes that then were traded. So we didn't know all that. I was just learning, basically. So what would I have done differently? I would have reinforced the idea of federation and confederation of many people, because that was the way that they were living before colonial time. That is to say, different tribes, different people living in different ecosystems, relating and re-establishing a system of reciprocity, which is the basic system of indigenous society throughout the Americas. Ideological sources of the Amazon frontier. I think that the basic sources were the missionary. First, the Jesuit, fortunately. Second, the Franciscan, a little bit more unfortunately. Then the Dominicans, fortunately, maybe again, and so on. The entire narrative of the Amazon people and the Amazon environment, an environment of the devil, because it's uncontrollable, because it's mysterious, because the forest, even in the European tradition, is the place where there are ogres, where there are all sorts of witches, etc., etc. The folk knowledge of the forest, even in Germany, France, in England, is always problematic. So that was the beginning of the construction of this ideology. Then came the rubber boom, brought in actually by the fear that the British were too interested in our resources. And Fitzcarraldo and Arana were building a new image of the jungle. We can exploit the jungle, the people are there to be enslaved, etc. So, and Belaunde takes possession of this ideology, the missionary ideology, the rubber boom Byron ideology, and foster this ideology. These are lands that are unoccupied, subutilized, and the people there don't know anything. They are ignorant. They just live gathering and collecting few birds and monkeys, and that's it. And so a misconception, total misconception of the civilization of the Amazonian area. And we have inherited that. And at my times, that was the view of the jungle. Even the ONERNA, Oficina Nacional de Recursos Naturales, was citing, I have quotes that are incredible. These people live hunting and gathering, they don't know how to cultivate the land. they just go around with bows and arrows, hunting birds and fishing, and that's it. 1969, 1970, 1975, and if you read reports now, they're still, most of the bureaucrats are still thinking in those terms. The nationalism. I think that, and I don't know, this is an hypothesis that I need many good historians to prove this hypothesis. I think that Velasco himself, I knew Velasco, I had a couple of encounters, very casual, very symptomatic of the type of person that Velasco was. Because I was living close to Velasco, I didn't know that when I moved there. Very small house in Chacalcayo, and Velasco had two houses, one in Miraflores and San Antonio, and the other one was in Calle Hilda. I have a chapter in my memoir about Calle Hilda. And I met him, I don't know if I can take too much time, probably for another moment. I met him a couple of times because he was walking with Doña Consuelo. And he approached me. And I was there with my dog, crunchy old dog from the Sierra. And he wanted to know what I was doing there. And I said, well, I work with moms. And we started to talk, and he asked me, what do you think about Dr. Carlos Delgado? Very difficult question. I'm good at anthropologists, etc., etc. And my American wife, Californian wife, went inside the house and brought a marmalade that we had done with sauco. Sauco is not used in Peru. It's actually used in Jauja to feed the pigs. No? But we had made a liquor, a mead, and so she gave it to Doña Consuelo. Said, try this marmalade. So we established this kind of good neighbors. Few weeks later, I was trying to start my old car, and the battery was dead. And Velasco was going with the official car, two cars, and the police car. And he stopped the car and said, can I push your car? And I said, I don't know. The president is allowed to push a car. And so I pushed my car and the car started. So I think that he had a very interesting personality, a very human personality. So whatever we can say about cult of personality, there were reasons to be. I became an admirer of Velasco after those two. Okay, nationalism again. I think that his idea, Velasco idea, I don't know about the other gentlemen, probably Fernando Maldonado, Karim, was to create a new society, a new citizenship, and that admitted differences. I think that there was an intention to respect cultural differences. The fact that Quechua was brought to be a national language together with Castilian, the effort to rescue some of the cultural tradition of Peru and the intention of being interested in the Amazonian people. For the first time in the history of Peru, the central government of Peru, Limeños basically, and Andean people looked beyond the Andes to 50% of the territory and found that there were people there, they were Peruvian. So I think that there was an intention of bringing nationalism into a different kind of nation, diverse, multiple. That's my interpretation. I need historians.
Okay, good questions. I'll start with the one about ownership, and I think nationalism go together, so I'll put Jamie and Mark's questions, combine those. And I think that the idea of ownership is, I never used that word, but I think that that's really what the big transformation was that allowed Chimbote to happen later, is that it was the state who then said, we own the water. And I think that without that fundamental change, so that's what they're, without that fundamental change, there wouldn't have been a Chimbote project, because the whole Chimbote project is built on the fact that it's the state who owns the water. And even though that switched in 2003 with decentralization, that moved back to the government of La Libertad instead of INADE in the central government, that was still government controlled. The water was, and government managed. And that, I think that change as a result of the 1969 water law was a huge one in terms of the state is the only way. So I would focus on the water, I think, more than the land in terms of ownership ideas. That's what stands out, at least in what I've seen. And so the state really conceived that it was the state's engineers and the Ministry of Agriculture, first and foremost, who should make all decisions, not only about who had the water, but what crops were grown then and how much water was used, because each crop required a certain amount of water. And so it was the Ministry of Agriculture who was deciding, okay, you own this land, we'll give you this much water, and if you need to grow these types of crops as a result. So that type of law, I think that's a pretty powerful change in terms of the ownership. And that then I think switches with the nationalism, that in the idea of nationalism that the water, it's the state. I mean, I think that is part of what their nationalist view was, is that the state could best control water for the best good of all Peruvians, is the idea. Of course, there's a tremendous tension in that and a problem, because as soon as you say that for La Libertad and for Chimbote, you're offending everybody in Ancash, who believes that the Santa River is born in Ancash, and therefore it is Ancashino, and it should not go to La Libertad. And so that struggle has been there for decades as well. So I think as soon as you start talking about nationalistic ideas of water, you're instantly into a tension of who owns the water. Does it stay in a watershed? Well, if it stays in the watershed, is it the people who are up closest to the source who should benefit from it? Is it the people who are producing the most amount of money from it? Is it the most number of people who benefit from it? I mean, what does that even mean? And I don't think that was ever really sorted out. And I think that was a tension. Maybe that's a reason that Chimbote never went forward, especially when we're in this part of the world, in this part of Peru, with opera being so powerful historically in La Libertad and in Chimbote. That I mean, that's a huge factor that's there as well. So I think that kind of the tension between the nationalism and the regionalism, and that's coming out in a lot of papers today, which I think is interesting, is the importance of regions and how that's playing out. And then the long-term, I think the long-term implications of that are still with us. At least that's what I'm seeing with the origins of Chimbote. All that is still Chinecas, which is the irrigation project for Ancash. That is in tremendous conflict right now. And so that regionalism versus nationalism, the new water law of 2009 has a similar emphasis on the greater good for all Peruvians, and they're still stuck in what does that mean? And that's still being hashed out over the last few years. So yeah, good questions. Then Adrian's question about what was lost, I would say lots. Chinecas fish, Nathan and I were talking about that yesterday. So the water, then all that water, this is what Nathan was telling me, so he's the expert, not me. I hadn't even really heard about this, but you take water out of the Santa River before it gets to the Pacific Ocean. What the Ancashinos and the Chimbotanos are saying is that you're removing a lot of nutrients from the water that then leave and go up into La Libertad and into the desert instead of flowing down into the ocean to help with the fish industry. So that's a tremendous loss that could be there. There's ecological and environmental aspects of that are lost. Yeah, lots of things like that. And then I would say that the campesinos, I mean, in hindsight, again, we can't do this, but what if Velasco had done the Chimbote project? What if he had given all this water to people in La Libertad? Maybe he would have been much more successful with his land reform there. Maybe it would have worked much better. Maybe he would have really undermined opera. I mean, that's what the goal of collectivizing the sugar estates there at first almost was to really, I think, to really get back at the opera supporters there. And maybe if he had delivered the water, it would have been a very different thing. So, but in the end, it's the campesinos who lost out in that. And then later they lose out also because now it's a bunch of big companies that are running this billion-dollar industry of agro-industry up there. And so the campesinos have all been bought out as the state has sold land in the intervalleys and with this tremendous subsidy that they're providing of giving water. They have, of course, a new company or a new individual who buys land within the Chimbote, they have to pay for the water, but it's a very cheap thing compared to the cost of building the infrastructure to get it there. And to buy land in it, I don't remember the numbers, but you have to put up, initially it's not very expensive, but then you have to promise to invest many thousands of dollars in the first year and each additional year after that. So it excludes all the smallholders and all the campesinos who could have possibly gotten land. So that's another population that's lost. There's a benefit, I think, for people, given the migration into La Libertad. I mean, Trujillo has grown incredibly since this project started. And a lot of that has to do with all the jobs in the agriculture. The people are flocking into that. So we're in a similar, I think, situation as the maquilas, maybe, where on the one hand, you've got a situation where this is not very good labor conditions. On the other hand, people are lining up to get those jobs because it's better than the alternative. And I think a lot more work needs to be done on Trujillo and La Libertad, and what are the socioeconomic conditions of the society where what's happening with the urban landscape of Trujillo that's just exploding in the last couple decades and what's going on there. So I think there's could be a lot more to uncover in terms of the gains and the losses too. So it's a great question.
All right, well, I feel like it's my doctoral defense again. Questions. Yeah, okay, so Jamie's question about ownership and this idea of land for those who work it, fish for those who fish it, I never saw that idea come up. I think, it's hard to tap into what the generals were thinking before expropriating, but I have a feeling that the expropriation came out of the sort of year-long crisis caused by El Nino, where they were looking at a series of companies on the verge of bankruptcy or on the verge of greater debt to foreign nations. So I think this is where the nationalism impact comes in. During the expropriation, Tantalian, General Tantalian, the Minister of Fisheries, mentioned explicitly that they want to keep the fishing industry out of the hands of foreign companies. So I don't think that there was this issue of ownership. Later in the revolutionary process, they do form cooperatives to give fishing back to the people, but that's a real problematic idea that doesn't really ever work out. As for the Adrian's question about the MLR and APRA, nobody talks about the MLR. I did a lot of oral history, and I realized a couple weeks after I did an interview that one of the people I was talking to was one of these MLR goons, right? And I didn't have a chance to go back and talk. I think I was already back in the States. But he never mentioned that he was a member of the MLR. He just said, what's your opinion of Velasco? He's a great guy, and I think he was trying to do a good thing. So maybe somewhere in my oral histories, I've missed some sort of MLR connection there. With regard to APRA, I think the MLR was not linked to APRA. I think APRA, at least from the sources I was able to consult, APRA and the Clasistas sort of joined forces in '73 to fight the MLR, to fight over this, the sort of closeness that was emerging between the MLR and the fishing industry, and or the lack of struggle, the lack of lucha. But the Clasistas didn't want anything to do with the APRA either, and they sort of pushed the APRA out. So I don't think that link is quite there between, I don't know if what Tantalian's relationship to APRA was. And this I think goes to George Phillips' question about Tantalian. It's really difficult to say what his politics were, because as for sources about Tantalian, I'm really only coming across his autobiography. And other than that, like everything is just sporadic mentions here and there, and there's no real analysis of what he was into. About nationalism, and I think you're talking about the tuna wars.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, the tuna wars.
Fish.
Yeah, I think we see nationalism and the revolution in Chimbote through the reconstruction efforts and the development efforts of the earthquake. The revolutionary government, and Mark writes a lot about this in his book, really emphasizes Chimbote as sort of a new center of development, a new sort of a real place where the revolution can challenge the oligarchic Lima, and they create this massive 13-volume plan about what they want to do with Chimbote and turn Chimbote into this new growth pole in the north, and turn Chimbote into a new industrial center and sort of play up the steel mill, play up the fishing industry, and expand the city. And there's a whole bunch, and I can send you a manuscript that I have out of a journal about that. So I think that's where I see more nationalism. I don't really see that in the fishing industry, aside from this issue of the foreigners. And then Jose Olaya. This was going to be my question for Chuck Walker, because as I was reading his paper, I'm thinking, oh, this is Jose Olaya. I mean, this is Jose Olaya is the Tupac Amaru for the fishing industry. Because I see the same thing. The third Congress of Peruvian fishermen, Peruvian Fishing Federation, was called the Congreso Jose Olaya Lalanda. I mean, it's there. So it's something I really didn't realize until this week. I didn't make that connection between Jose Olaya and this idea of this iconography. And I think in the Fisherman's Hall, one of the pictures on the wall is Jose Olaya, right? And that picture, that Tantalean, was Tantalean behind Jose Olaya, or in front of Jose Olaya. So I think there's definitely something there, a connection there.
Okay, perfect timing. Thank you all for coming to the second panel. We are taking a break now.